Now, we have a moment to pause and reflect on why we're here. What do we mean by strategy? How do we define it? What are the most effective approaches and methodologies? What does it all mean for theater and for our field? As a team, we work with a small task force. We conducted a survey. Many of you took it. Thank you. We combed through a lot of research just to sense make all of these things. Gus Schulenburg, a core member of our communications and conference team, took the time and care to thoughtfully go through all of that stuff we got, and we thought that we would take this time to create a framework for what we mean by planning, and hopefully these insights will be useful for the rest of our time together and also for our afternoon case studies. So Gus, it's all yours.
Thank you, Delphina. A theater in Philadelphia asks, what if the route to sustainability is greater artistic risk? A search engine asks, how can we stay nimble as we scale up to really big size? A theater in Arlington asks, how can we align our operations toward opportunity? The US Navy asks, what are we going to do when these oceans keep rising? A theater in San Diego asks, will our audience follow us all the way into the ocean? These are all very different questions, asked by very different organizations with different sizes and missions, but they all share a single quality. They are seeking to make sense of the future, and the answer can only come through a process. A theater in New York tries putting their community center stage. An email marketer asks, what if we made all of our employees project leaders? A theater in Ashland goes to Silicon Valley to hack their thinking. A theater in Memphis challenges funding inequities through grassroots mobilizations. These are strategic decisions, and they try to not only understand the future, but change it. A video game company becomes profitable by eliminating all the bosses. A theater in Houston finishes a transformative capital campaign. A shoe company saves itself through a distributed leadership model. A theater in Boston goes from surviving to thriving by creating theater out in the streets with their community. These are all examples of strategic results, and these results, decisions, questions are all a part of strategic thinking, but they did not all come from strategic plans. That's the first takeaway that we want to share with you. That strategic thinking is a bigger ballpark than just plans. It includes everything from the long time horizon of scenario planning to the let's move fast and break shit model of the lean startup. And we are going to share those with you today. Why? Because you asked us to. When you took this survey, one of the top priorities that you said was, we want multiple strategic frameworks. Sometimes the traditional strategic plan works really well, but sometimes it doesn't, and we want options. You also asked to learn about engagement from board and staff. How can we get people deeply invested in our strategy? And you asked, how do we adapt to evolving circumstances? What are our measurements and benchmarks? And this is what we're going to be doing together today. So those are our goals. Multiple strategic frameworks. We're going to establish shared language because we don't all mean the same thing when we say strategy. We're going to share those research results. We're going to try to connect dots from the for-profit business and some of that wonderful stuff that Kaihan shared with us to the not-for-profit theater. And there's actually a surprising amount of overlap, even though we don't always use the same language. And we're going to introduce the breakout sessions so you have a really good idea of what room you want to walk into out of here. So what do we mean when we say strategy? For me personally, I think the question is, well, why do we care? Why does strategy matter at all? And the dean of strategic thinking, Peter Drucker, had this amazing quote where he compares strategic decision-making to time travel. And I really like that, right? It's like we've got all these possible futures out there, and we don't know how to prepare for them, but with strategy we can make them all one thing. Or at least that's the goal. Or in the words of a far less successful strategic planner, it gives us the future in the instant. P.S. Classic strategic planning mistake. They had a great vision, right? But they wouldn't adapt their tactics, you know? If you keep murdering people and it doesn't work, you should probably try something else. But strategy comes to us from war. The word comes from the ancient Greek word for general, and most of the early thought leaders were generals. Of course, Sun Tzu, the most famous, who differentiated between tactics and strategy. And Clausewitz, who reminded us that if our strategic plans stay in the binders and hard drives and don't actually talk to the world, we're going to have a problem. And what that has done is it's given us a framework that's very particular in terms of the who, when, what, and why of strategy. For war, it's the heroic leaders gazing deeply into the future, deploying tactics on the battlefield, crushing enemies. For the business world, it's brilliant CEOs staring into the futurity of uncertain tomorrows. Peter Drucker, very poetic. Deploying value chains and core competencies to dominate and disrupt the marketplace. Now, here in 501c3 land, we're not quite as bloody and not quite as competitive, but it's a very similar pattern. It's executive board and staff with vision statements and SWOT analyses, deploying best practices to build capacity for our missions. But in the worlds of war, profit, and art, that's changing. And especially the who and when. And we think that the who and when are changing in really useful ways. So that's why we're going to be sharing this with you today. So, here's what we did. We did a literature review, articles, resources, case studies from the for-profit and not-for-profit worlds, in-depth conversations with a lot of people in this room, with strategic consultants, with some of the great strategic thinkers on the TCG staff, and the strategic thinking survey that so many of you took. Thank you for taking that time. Here's who took it. We had 96 people from 89 different organizations, and as you can see, it's a pretty diverse group of budget sizes. And there were problems were shared, and the great thinking was shared all across those budget sizes. And here's the landscape of experience. So about 40 of you had just completed the strategic plan in the last 3 years, and there were 18 of you, we won't name who it is, who have never been a part of a strategic planning process. Perhaps count yourself lucky. But there's a lot of diversity within that too. There's a bunch of people that are about to begin a planning process, that are in the middle of planning, or that are in the middle of executing. And you're going to see that diversity reflected in our breakout sessions. Some of the breakout session leaders are embarking on a radically new strategic planning process. Others are coming to you after a really successful strategic planning process, and other folks are in the middle of it trying to make sense of it. Because that's what's out here, that's what we wanted to present to you in breakout sessions. And just to say, there's a wide diversity of experience with strategic thinking in this room. I'm sure there's a lot of you that were like, Clausewitz, when that quote came on. You're strategic thinking experts. But then there are some other folks who perhaps are like, fake like you know who Peter Drucker is, fake like you know who Peter Drucker is. And that's all cool too. I think what we learned from Kaihan is that the field of strategic thinking is moving really fast, which means expertise is a moving target. I'm going to be sharing these slides and also the bibliography that informed our research for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive into the various areas of strategic thinking that we're going to touch on. But in the spirit of our Facebook overlords, we are going to move fast and break things. So, who contributes? As you see, it is largely executive board and executive staff. Next in line is consultants, actually ahead of other board members. Then you see staff, and way down there at the bottom are artists and community, that brave, slender blue involving community in their strategic planning process. But you're very interested in this question of who. Some folks are creating strategies where there are standing committees of their board that are always focused on strategy, hearkening back to what Kaihan was saying. Others are really struggling with a diverse set of constituent interests and conflicts. And then others are really frustrated when the wrong people are put in the wrong rooms. Don't worry, board presidents, this isn't you. I pulled this quote from some theater that's not here today. You don't need to feel bad. So the who. Who participates in your process, and this is equally important, at what points? Who contributes to its execution? How wide and deep is the ownership of the plan? Critical, right? Among staff, board, artists, and community. And what is the role of a consultant? We gave these questions to all of the breakout session leaders. They may have completely ignored them, but I think that some did not. And hopefully this will help unlock your thinking about who is a part of your process and at what stages of your planning process they jump into the mix. So, what's the time horizon? Well, as you can see, the vast majority of you are in the 3 to 5 year time horizon. That's the legacy we've inherited from the business world, and it's largely what you see here. There are a few theaters that are doing longer horizons and a very small number that are doing more agile processes. Now, here's a couple terminology things. We're going to use time horizon to mean the overarching length of time considered by your strategic process, ideally the shortest distance between you and your goals. But equally important and often less discussed is the tempo and the rhythm of your strategic process, right? How often are you deploying tactics, evaluating them, adapting them? How regularly are you meeting to do that? Or is it very irregular? Are you constantly responding to what's happening in the world? And when you put those things together, you begin to ask, do I want a choppy process, which is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride, but is also going to be really responsive to the waves of the world? Or do I want a smooth process, where things don't change that much because they don't need to? We got it. And as you can see, most of us right now are using relatively smooth processes. About a third of folks are only meeting to adapt and evaluate their plan once a year. Another third are doing it bi-quarterly or quarterly, so right 2 to 4 times a year. And then a smaller number, a little less than a third, are doing monthly or bi-monthly. There are some folks where it really varies, and yes, there are a few strategic plans that are never evaluated, and we will pass over those plans in a respectful silence. So you're also really grappling with the when. How do we communicate with funders that 5-year strategic plans aren't helpful? Flexibility is the name of the game. We want a living document. Are strategic plans old hat? Should we be thinking about micro-strategies for individual goals? And are there successful and growing orgs which set values and are agile and responsive to their environment? And the answer is yes. So here are the whens we're going to talk about. What's that time horizon, 3 to 5 years or longer or shorter? What's the tempo and rhythm? How are you evaluating, adapting, deploying, iterating? What are the metrics and benchmarks? These are the questions that we've given the breakout session leaders for you all to discuss when you're in those rooms. But I hope that you notice something about what I'm saying. There's an assumption implicit in everything I've said about the when, and that's that it's a linear process. That strategy has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's a whole bunch of synchronous parts working harmoniously towards a single goal. But it doesn't have to be like that, right? It doesn't work like that in natural systems, in evolutionary systems. And increasingly, strategy is occupying this evolutionary space. Strategic processes are, and meaning is emerging organically. There's not necessarily a defined time horizon. And the pieces are interdependent, but they're asynchronous. So you can think about the linear process as the well-made play, removing any judgments you have over well-made plays. Well-made plays are awesome. And you can think of the evolutionary process as a devised rehearsal, right? Where you're not always sure where you are, but something cool is happening. And just like the those narrow categories of well-made play and devised rehearsal really shouldn't be binaries, it's the same thing with these two things. Just as you might have a devised process that eventually moves into a much more linear rehearsal process, a strategic process can have evolutionary components and linear components. And we're definitely seeing that in the business world. So, why is strategic planning important? Well, first off, y'all have been doing a really great job of it, okay? Over the last 10 years, the theaters that have taken the fiscal survey during that time period reported an increase in net assets of 30%. And I bet that's largely part of really smart strategic planning from the strategic wizards in this room, making some hard decisions in dark hours. You're amazing, and we salute you. But after we're done saluting, also important to note that in that same time frame, attendance declines 9%, and working capital is an increasing challenge for the field. So when we look at these things where we're strong and look at these things when we're still having challenges, one of the questions is, are there different strategic processes that we could employ that would lead to different outcomes? Now, we're going to hear tomorrow from someone who studies the future for a living, but even if you don't study the future for a living, you get the sense, at least as I do, that it's not only more complex every day, but the rate of the complexity increases every day, right? It's hard to keep up, and that makes planning really difficult. Or in the words of a strategic consultant who I am ethically reluctant to cite, but who really said it better than anyone, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So how do we plan to keep the future from punching us in the mouth? Well, here's how we're going to do that. We're going to be looking at some examples from the for-profit world, from the military, from some theaters, and we're going to be sharing what we can learn from those, and in many cases we'll be taking a deeper dive into the breakout sessions. Now, we're not going to be looking this far into the future, where every word of this presentation no longer is used, and we have a new North Star, but we are going to be thinking about how these various strategic processes think about the future and what their relationship is to time. So if you've got a lean startup methodology, you might be looking at a 6-month frame or less. If it's strategic alignment, maybe 1 to 3 years. Strategic planning, now we're getting into 3 to 5. And scenario planning is 5 years plus. You'll also note over here, there's these evolutionary processes, agile and emergent, that don't necessarily have a defined time frame. So why don't we start with scenario planning? That's the big one. That's the long one. It's 10 years plus. It's often very smooth, and it's usually led by researchers. It comes to us, as you might expect from this helpful photo, from the military. And that's actually a very helpful piece of information, because the mission of the military has largely been unchanged since its beginning with the US, and probably won't be all that different 100 years from now. It's still going to be trying to protect our interests, for better or worse. But how the world changes is incredibly important to the military. So they are constantly scenario planning. My brother-in-law serves in the Navy, and he's a part of a team working on climate change scenario planning. And their time horizon is 2100. So they're looking way out. And the way this works is, it's mission protection, okay? If sea levels rise to here, how many bases do we need to move? Which ones are going to need to be raised? How much is that going to cost? If it costs that much, where's that money going to come from? And that may never come to pass, but when it does come to pass, naval leadership is going to be ready. They're going to know what to do. That's why scenario planning can be really helpful. It can also be helpful for organizational transformation. If you want to look into the long horizon of what your organization wants to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it can be really helpful to do this kind of scenario planning. A couple things that are really different from traditional strategic planning. It's all about modeling uncertainty, right? A strategic plan, there's a degree of chutzpah, right? It's like, we got this vision. We're going to make it happen. Here is our plans. That's not how it is with scenario planning, right? The readiness is all. You just want to know what might happen, okay? And one of the things that's interesting about this particular report from Paul Shoemaker is that he actually draws a parallel between the end of apartheid in South Africa and scenario planning. Because what he said is that there were some significant corporations in apartheid South Africa who did scenario planning and decided that it would not be advantageous to their businesses to continue doing apartheid. Thanks, y'all. But what's interesting, right, about Paul's report, and it's a great article, is that he actually misses the real genius of scenario planning in that country, which was Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela looked at a number of scenarios, some of which involved a whole lot of violence, and some of which didn't. And when you read his writing, he's very clear on the different scenarios which would escalate a violent response. This would be strategic destruction of property. This might be specific violent acts against military. And with each different scenario of the apartheid government stepping up their violence, there was a scenario for how they would react. And it was because of that long-term thinking that Mandela and so many others were able to make that change. So, okay. We're not all the military. We're not all Nelson Mandela. Is scenario planning useful for us? Well, of course, the reality is we do it all the time, and some theaters are beginning to do it in really interesting ways. Take, for example, Oregon Shakespeare Festival. They have just launched a long-range planning process that looks 10 years out. If you are interested in the kinds of questions that a theater asks when their time horizon is 10 years out, go to this breakout session. Also, we already use elements of scenario planning in traditional strategic planning, right? We know that there's going to be a time period of that where we're doing an environmental analysis along with our internal analysis. Now, because so many of you are really well versed in this methodology, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about it now, except to say that it remains really, really valuable. And perhaps one of the most important lessons from this traditional form of strategic planning is that you cannot cut your way to growth. You have to double down on the art. And that's the beautiful story that Lantern Theater Company is going to be telling in their breakout session. So if you want to engage in that kind of conversation, go see the Lantern. Now, what if you don't want a strategic plan, but you're still not feeling quite right in your organizational body? It's time to go to the chiropractor. It's time for some strategic alignment. And that sort of sad metaphor that didn't really land is actually it's actually really helpful. It's helped me think about it, and that's not just because I had a really bad back injury last year, and so I actually know what it feels like to be out of alignment. All you are doing is managing pain. That is all you are doing when you are out of alignment. And what strategic alignment is doing is trying to move you out from managing pain to be ready to seize opportunities, right? And so how strategic alignment works is you take a look at your programming, you look at it and you say, is this still true to our mission? Is this doing the thing that we want it to do? And if it is, does it need the resources that it has, or does it need more? Or does it need less? And if it's not doing the thing we need it to do, can we get rid of it, right? And this kind of process can be tremendously transformative for an organization. Now, our friends at Signature Theater in Arlington just completed a very successful traditional strategic planning process, but they want to get their alignment right? They want to get nimble. They want to get entrepreneurial and opportunistic. So they are about to embark on a strategic alignment process. And if you're like, ooh, yeah, I think I want to be in that room, go see Signature. Okay, now we are up to the lean startup methodology. Silicon Valley, y'all. It is very different. It is sometimes as short as a 6-month time horizon, and in terms of choppiness, it is rough seas. This is because it is essentially an idea in search of a business model, right? That's the lean startup methodology, and that means it needs to be a couple of things. It needs to be user-driven and staff-responsive. You can't spend a whole bunch of time cooking up a beautiful vision. You just got to get out there and mix it up. And there actually is a startup school that's real. It's called the Y Combinator. It's a fascinating venture capitalist firm. If you're looking for more information about startup methodology, I definitely recommend it. But 3 attributes that are worth our conversation right now is the first is that you throw out the plan and you have what's called a business model canvas. Basically, how can you summarize your hypotheses as briefly as possible? You may remember a couple years ago, there was a CEO who wrote their strategy on like a napkin. And this became what the business world was obsessed with. You'd read all of these articles about napkins on strategy. But there's actually an element of truth in that, right? If it's that simple, you can move really quickly. And that's what the lean startup is built to do. You also need to get out of the building, right? You need to be developing things with the customers, the community for which you are making the work, to test out the hypotheses. You cannot wait to get the plan right. This means you need an agile development process. You create a minimum viable product, test, iterate, repeat, repeat, repeat. We're going to talk a little bit more about that agile development later, but important to note, we have an organization here that is dedicated to teaching lean startup methodology to theaters. Like, that is the thing they do. So, if you are interested in hearing about that methodology, go into Form Theatrical's room. Now, I don't... yes, okay, we still are good on time. Okay, so a couple quotes from folks about why lean startup is valuable. From Amazon, organize that so you can do as many experiments per unit of time as possible. Move fast and break things, our friends from Facebook. Unless you are breaking stuff, you are not moving fast enough. I'm taking that as my philosophy for this presentation. But you can also do this at much larger organizations that have a much larger history, right? Size either liberates or paralyzes. We try to remember that our size should allow us to take more swings. And I think what's important about that is the lean startup methodology, you can play that out in any number of ways. It can be how your organization functions, or it can be how a piece of your organization functions. We're actually kind of used to this, right, in our second stages. We have these areas where we take more artistic risk than we might take on our main stage, but we don't always think that way about our strategy, and we can, right? A company that may not call it lean startup methodology, but is adopting some of the same tactics in really profound ways, is the theater offensive. They just went through a remarkably successful strategic planning process that was all about getting out of the building and iterating, adapting, evaluating, programming. The programming that worked, it scaled up. And their organization has been radically transformed by that process. So if you're interested in community-driven strategy, go see the theater offensive. Okay, we were going to do a turn and talk, but I don't think we have time for that. So just imagine that you had time to process this. Okay? And I kind of think that you're still with me, so we're gonna press on, okay? We're now going to move into things that are a little bit harder to grasp in terms of strategy, at least they have been for me. We're gonna move into what happens when you adapt that agile project management as sort of core to how you operate, right? So again, this is the evolutionary process we're gonna be thinking about. There's this thing called the Agile Manifesto, which was created by a whole bunch of software project designers. And these 4 points are really helpful. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It is the relationships that matter. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Don't try to get the whole thing right. Try to have something that works. And how fast can you get there? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. How can we think of our relationships with our users as collaborative rather than a space for negotiation? And responding to change over following a plan. Here's a graphic that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at, but I like the shape. What you can see is that this is a circular process, right? And it constantly deploys things, but it is constantly circling back. You are always testing, always iterating, always evaluating and adapting. Why are you doing this? Because simplicity is the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. Whew. I would like to take that to heart in my own life, right? How can we do less work? That is agile strategy. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. It is not top-down, it is self-organizing. That's what leads to that kind of simplicity. And finally, reality bats last. Doesn't matter how good you are, in the end, reality is going to bat last. So why wait, right? Why not get it in front of reality as soon as you can? Now, if we think about that agile project management, and we think about how it can scale up through an organization, you hopefully begin to understand what this weird slide is, right? If you imagine agile project management up there as being, we do that here, we do that here, we do that here, but in other ways we're a traditional organization, and you imagine emergent as all we do is agile, baby, that's how we roll. This is that journey that we're about to go on. But it doesn't really matter at what size you're bringing agile into your organization. The key is everyone has to be clear on vision, everyone has to be clear on values, and everyone has to be super clear on how the processes of your organization works. That's true for any kind of strategic plan, but it is doubly, trebly so for this kind of work. So, Google, a great example, perhaps the most famous, 70-20-10. 70% of their organizational time, an employee, is spent doing core work. 20% is passion projects, and 10% is scaling up those passion projects. One of those passion projects is Gmail, right? That did not come from a traditional strategic planning process, yet it is one of the most strategic accomplishments that Google has ever had. And you can see here again, Eric is talking about how can we have as many at-bats, they really like baseball metaphors, as anyone else in the world. Another example, Mailchimp. Perhaps you have Mailchimp as your email marketer. What's really cool about Mailchimp is how projects move forward in their organization. Any employee can have an idea. If it's a good idea, they will be able to recruit another employee to dedicate some of their time to prototyping that idea. Prototypes then compete. The coolest prototypes attract the most people, and once there are enough people, that prototype becomes a project, and it has access to all of the resources that Mailchimp has. And then those projects are executed through agile management, right? I included this picture because it's board game night at Mailchimp, and when you spend time on some of these software companies' websites, you realize that they're all about trying to show you how much more fun they're having than you. Like, all right, I get it. It's all ball pits and board game nights, guys. So Google 70-20-10, Mailchimp, it goes a little bit further, right? There's still a hierarchy, but it goes a little bit further in their organizational culture. Zappos, we heard about this from Kayan, right? They have a thing called the holacracy. What on earth does that word mean? Well, actually, they publish a whole bunch of information about it. You can Google it. They have a thing called the Culture Book, which is updated annually, that talks about it. But it is processes by which a distributed leadership model can function. What this means is roles are defined by the work, right? Not by any hierarchy that you might have in the institution. Roles are constantly updated. You might be leading this project and supporting that one. Distributed authority, decisions and accountability live in a local place. There are rapid iterations, and everybody plays by the same rules, including the CEO, who is also having more fun than us right now with his shoes. So, right, we've gone from Google to Mailchimp to Zappos. Another infamous Peter Drucker quote is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that can mean a couple different things, right? It can mean if your culture is bad, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is. But I think there's another way that we can read that, and which is at a certain point, culture and strategy become almost indistinguishable. What I mean by that here is Valve is a video game company that has no bosses, no managers. Everybody's in charge. How does that possibly work? Go read more about them. But the key thing is that per employee, they are more profitable than Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. So, we are now going to move from approaches to content. Roger Martin, in The Real World, there is no meaningful distinction between strategy and execution. Oprah. The key to realizing a dream is to focus not on success, but on significance, which I love. And then even the small steps and little victories along your path will take on greater meaning. Okay, a little Yoda. I couldn't help myself. So, okay. This first round of breakout sessions, right, are all going to be focused on approach, all those breakouts we heard. The second round is going to be focused a little bit more on content, right? We're going to be moving a little bit into the execution piece to figure out how those little victories can take on greater meaning, how strategy and execution can live together, how we can do or do not. So we're going to be engaging with these folks again. But first, let's take a look at what you are using strategic planning for. Perhaps not surprising, I mean, certainly it's been a theme of a lot of fall forums, is capitalization. That's the number one thing y'all are working on. Other than that, we see audience and community-based things, artistry. It's really actually beautiful to see how many strategic plans prioritize the art. Organizational culture can be board engagement, staff engagement, or a little bit of both. And then branding and marketing was number 5, and you can see on down the line there. And so we're going to be doing some of that with y'all. Alley Theater is going to be talking about capitalizing transformation. They went through 2 recent strategic plans that have led to a radically different organization. If you want to know how to use traditional strategic planning to wind up with a fundamentally different organization in a much, much stronger place, this is the place to go. Wizards of capitalization. The Public Theater. As you know, they've been doing some fascinating programmatic shifts in their organization lately. But when that happens, how do you keep the organization rallied around that? So they're going to be talking about habits for a healthy institutional body. Love this picture. This is the audience going into the Pacific Ocean. La Jolla Playhouse, they've been doing some amazing things around audience building strategies. Of course, most notably, some of the stuff that's bringing folks into cars and into eucalyptus groves and into the water, but some other strategies as well. So if you're interested in strategic planning around audience building, go to La Jolla. Hadilu Theater is going to be talking about fundraising, but not really fundraising. They're going to be talking about the strategic ask. Often with fundraising, we're in a very tactical place. How do you elevate up and get your fundraising in a strategic place? If you want to know about that, check out Hadilu. And yes, TCG is not immune from having to present about strategy. We're going to be talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Not just our external programs, but the internal work that we've been doing, which has been joyful and challenging, and we have been doing many, many course corrections to get that right. And that's very much about shifting culture around strategy. So if you're interested in hearing how TCG is trying to do that, come check us out. Okay, I've reached the end here. And before I close, I guess I just want to say that I, like Patrick, love strategy. It is so exciting to imagine that we can bring the future into our hands, right? And that we can change it. There's that crazy quote from George Orwell, right? And it goes, "The person who controls the past controls the future, and the person who controls the present controls the past." Now, of course, there's a whole totalitarian aspect to that quote that we're just going to ignore for right now. Not going to pay attention to that. Adapting, iterating. What I think that means, right, is that we have that power in this room to create strategies that can transform that future. And I am so excited to go on that journey with you today. Thanks. So we have a little time for Q&A, but it can also just be a conversation among all of us about any of this stuff that we've talked about. I took away your process time, which I apologize for.
Just a quick question on reminding us of the reminding us of the framework of the question about what we're doing strategic planning around. I don't know if you can go back to the slide, but I'm just curious because having filled it out, I've totally forgotten what the question was. But is it exclusively that the strategic plan is focused around that issue? I was surprised to see diversity and equity so low on the list.
It's actually, well, there's two great conversation pieces there. I think the first is that very few strategic plans have only one focus, very few. The vast majority are usually moving 2 to 3 to 4 things forward. It's one of the things that I think in our research it was where we were most impressed with the field, that they were thinking that way. And all of the breakout sessions that you're going to be engaging with are going to be talking about that. I am trying to get to that slide for you. But I built in a lot of silly animation, which is making everything take a little bit longer. The second piece about equity, diversity, and inclusion, I really appreciate that question. And not just because, I'm one of the folks that is collaborating at TCG around that work. We had the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Institute meeting yesterday. And one of the things that was so profound for me and really moving was to see theaters thinking strategically, collaboratively, right? I think it was what Michael was asking about with Kayan at the end of that last session, was that it doesn't actually have to all be about competition. We can't pretend competition doesn't exist. It obviously does, but it's not the only option. And one of the amazing things that I think is happening at the Institute is you're seeing a cohort of theaters that are not always thinking in their own self-interest, but are thinking about the health of the field. So that's some hope that I have. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting is these models, especially the agile to emergent models, are applicable on a field-wide scale. They don't just have to operate organizationally. One of the things I think is really interesting about some of the social justice and civil rights movements right now is that you don't always see the charismatic leader in the front of it dictating the strategy from on high, right? You see a lot of emergent strategy. Folks sharing values, sharing vision, having a clear sense of what their process is, but iterating all over the country, adapting to local circumstances to make social change. So I think that those models can actually be used for cross-theater collaboration as well.
Does strategic planning model, which allows it versus other, does it correlate at all to the size of budget?
That's a great question. Yeah, the question was, if folks didn't hear, how does budget size compare to the different models that you adopt? I think there's a tendency to say the larger the organization, the longer the time frame. But I don't think that's always the case. And it's also important to remember these things are really modular, and that you may steal some stuff from scenario planning in your traditional strategic planning process, or you could run those things kind of concurrently, trying a bunch of lean startup processes, while at the same time doing some research on some bigger questions. So I think people should use what they want, and not feel bound by size. Kathy.
Are there, in the research, thank you, in the research you've been doing, have you, I mean, I love form theatricals and the idea of the lean startup. It's all so exciting. Yay. But I wonder about funding. I wonder about, we have a non-traditional organizational structure anyway. And so I wonder about like where you feel, or if you've thought at all about where funding is in this world. Because when you show up with an emergent or agile plan and they say, oh, no, this does not look like a strategic plan.
That's real. And there's two things that I think are worth talking about there. One is relationship with the funding community. There was some other concern or questions around expectation for strategic planning as part of a relationship with a funder. There's another quote from the executive director of Blue Avocado that says a funder found that like 80% of their capacity building grants was going to strategic planning consultants, right? I'm not sure if that's true. That was, something that was in that particular article. So that's a really great space for conversation, I think, because, The second piece of it, though, is that the reality is that theaters have a very particular funding model, even independent of the relationship with funders. There's a certain regularity to when certain kinds of income is coming in. It's show-based, and then it's campaign-based, annual appeal-based, right? And so that makes it a little bit more challenging when, in a for-profit world, oftentimes that earned income piece can be a lot faster. And so I don't really have an answer for it, except to say that I think there are folks who are doing it really well. Citing the theater offensive is their financial transformation that was linked to that fast community-driven piece is really interesting. And Form Theatricals, a key part to their presentation is going to be about risk at low cost. So hopefully there will be some things in those sessions that provide answers to that question. Oh, we're at time. Awesome. Yes. So I'm done. That was fun. So I'm now going to be turning it over to, Devin is telling me to do something. Okay. Yes, Gail and Ralph. I'm turning it over to the wonderful Gail and Ralph, who are going to be talking about a wonderful form of agile project management for trustees that has been moving forward. So